Well, hello, my name is Brennan Borgestad. I'm the business development manager with Skyla. And today we've got James McJunkin on the call with me. He's got an extensive knowledge just with experience and being in the security space with experiences in the FBI, as well as with the Chicago Cubs, one of our customers, as well as a lot of other different areas there. James, we're really glad to have you on the call today.
Hey, thank you, Brennan. Appreciate you inviting me, and I'm happy to participate. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, before we get started, would love to just learn more about your background. Like I mentioned, you were working in the FBI, but kind of even before that, and then even kind of in between and after that too. Would love to learn about your background and what your experiences were like.
Sure. Well, I mean, my background goes way back. I was a child when I joined the Pennsylvania State Police, right after my 21st birthday. And I was with them for about 4 years. Then I went into the FBI at the old age of 25. And I did 25 years, a little over 25, almost 26 years with the FBI as a special agent, and then worked my way up through a series of promotions to some very lofty ranks within the organization. And then I transitioned in 2012, following my retirement at the FBI, to Chief Security Officer position at Discover Financial. During that time, I spent 4 years as a CISO, or the CISO at Discover. And then after I left, thought I was finished with my professional career altogether. My wife reminded me that I wasn't finished, and so I went out and found a job, thankfully, with the Chicago Cubs, leading their security and safety team. I did that for almost 2 years, and then I recently left the Cubs to come to work for GSIS, which is where I'm at today as a principal with their company. And that's a consulting firm. That's a consulting firm that provides security consulting services to vast amount of clients and all sorts of different industries.
That's great. That's awesome. And so with your background in police and then FBI too, I mean, was that something you always wanted to do as a kid? You were like, hey, I wanted to be a police officer, an FBI agent, or when did that kind of start? And obviously you started young too. So
it was. I mean, I grew up on a dairy farm in Western Pennsylvania. So I think my initial strategy was to do anything that would get me off the farm. So I worked really, really hard to try to find a way out. Now, as I get older, I wish I could go back to that life, because it was actually not as bad as I thought it was at the time. But yeah, my father also had a series of businesses. He owned and operated a gas station for probably 10 or 12 years. And that gas station, he did a lot of the service for the Pennsylvania State Police. So I was in the station as a kid and watched him interact with a bunch of troopers when they were bringing those cars in for service. And I actually washed a few of them myself during that time frame. So it was during that time that I became very a favorable impression of the Pennsylvania State Police from my contact with them. So that was my career goal from a very young age, was to become a trooper. I did that, and I was successful in that after college, and I did that for almost 4 years. But I was lured then to something higher speed and fancier, I thought, which was the FBI. So I volunteered, took a test, went through all the interviews, and miraculously was selected to be a special agent. And then I went off to San Antonio, Texas was my first office. I spent 9 years there. Worked some great cases with some great people, both in the state, local, and within the FBI. My relationships there were very strong, very, very good people. I then went off to North Georgia and spent 7 years there, 2 years as an agent and 5 years as the supervisor for 3 resident agencies in the northern end of the state. And then after 9/11, life changed. So I was then transferred to Washington, D.C., to FBI headquarters, Counterterrorism Division. And I was back and forth, mainly at headquarters, but I did 2 stints in the Washington field office, one as an assistant special agent in charge and acting special agent in charge. And then back then as the assistant director in charge, just how I finished my career.
Okay, awesome. And so you mentioned with the post 9/11 work, heading back to headquarters, what were your responsibilities during that time, and what was your tasks and goals during that time?
Well, I think after 9/11, Bob Mueller was the director at the time, and he was, very interested in, and if you've ever worked or gotten to know Mr. Mueller, He was very precise in what his expectations were, and he had very high levels of expectation with your performance. So for him, working for him was a very interesting time in my life. And as you know, after 9/11, the FBI was asked to sort of switch from sort of being a largely reactive, sort of solve the whodunit type of organization into one that under Mueller had to be intelligence driven. So the FBI had to make a huge cultural change there. We had to change our operational approach. We had to hire and train analysts that were able to fit into the FBI culture and actually provide a certain level of service and performance that met the FBI performance expectations. And then we had to figure out how to operate in that environment. So that included relationships with the CIA, relationships with the Department of Defense, mainly within the Special Forces Operations commands, and also within the Department of State at the ambassador level. And we ended up having to sort of really change the way we did business. And that came, there was a lot of pain involved with that, because at headquarters, we clearly understood what our goal was, but then getting the field to change the way they did business to sort of meet the expectations of headquarters was a different front in the war on terrorism. How to change our own culture within and get people to stop doing something that they were comfortable with and the way they'd always done it into a new way, a new sort of direction was a very difficult feat. So I was involved in all of that. That was, I would consider myself one of the architects, not the only architect, obviously, but one of the architects in changing that cultural approach from one of reaction to proactive stance, and to be intelligence driven, which was what Bob Mueller wanted us to do.
That's great. And so with that too, I know you mentioned you were in the Texas office, and some of those, like you mentioned, the offices that had to eventually change too. That experience moving there, then back to the corporate headquarters, did a lot of that kind of help make your decisions of, hey, I know what it's like to be in the more field offices and not the corporate? Did that kind of help when you're realigning the proactive means too?
Oh, it did. Understanding. I mean, I was in the field for almost 17 years before I went back to headquarters for my first tour. So part of the cultural change had to do with me changing the way I thought about things and how I approached things, and then my expectations of how the field would change was colored and influenced by that exact experience. So having been a field agent and a supervisor for so long in the FBI with no FBI headquarters experience until I landed there after 9/11, really equipped me for actually doing a better job, I think, of managing that transition in the field for those field offices.
That's great. And other than the post 9/11 too, what other big investigations did you work on, or some of the other big ones? Obviously 9/11 being one of the big names in that side, but what other large areas did you work on?
Well, I mean, I was involved in the Oklahoma City investigation to a limited effect. I wasn't actually on the ground in Oklahoma City, but there were a lot of tangential leads that were followed in the field that my units or squads were involved with. We were also in the same sort of, I was transferred actually from Texas to Atlanta during the time frame of the Olympic bombing there. And also there were 2 bombings after that occurred that related to the same subject that occurred after the Olympics that we were heavily involved in. I was involved in a lot of major investigations that probably no one ever really heard about, but within the region that I was in, they were significant cases. I worked public corruption, mainly police-related public corruption. So my involvement was not only criminal organizations and their criminal activity, but also the influence of and involvement by sworn law enforcement officers. So that was a very interesting time in my career. But also a lot of violent crime, a lot of drug cartel type work. I did a lot of time in the street doing physical surveillance of drug targets in all over the Southwest border during my time in San Antonio. A lot of really, really interesting cases that I worked with over time. So it was a very interesting time. I wouldn't change a single day of my career. I had a ball. I got to admit, I was challenged. I was engaged. I was always busy, and I wouldn't regret a second of that.
That's great. And just so we're clear, I'm not getting into knock at the door. That any of this classified stuff, I'm not getting taken out or anything for hearing this, right?
No,
So
no, no. I'm talking at the level that's appropriate. Yes.
Perfect. I just want to make sure. So, no, that's great. And so from that though, too, you're in that the FBI side and the police side even before that. Then the transition, like you mentioned, into Discover, and then even to the Chicago Cubs. What was that transition like? What kind of prompted it? I know there was the retirement itself. Was there anything that prompted then the switch to the private security space? And what was that experience like?
Well, I think the transition to private security or private corporate level security from a high level government investigative capacity was quite the transition. Now, for me, I was lucky because Discover. They had a lot of great people at Discover, and Discover really sort of, accepted me into the role and did everything they could to sort of teach me about the business as I developed my approach to security within that business. So what I had to do is it really was a transition from everything from how you approach things, the speed of which you approach things, the methodology that you employ to get your strategies in place. We call it a strategy or a case strategy at the FBI. They called it a business argument or business proposal. So the terminologies were different. And I used to describe it as sitting in a room watching a baseball game and listening to a foreign commentator that's speaking in a language that's totally unfamiliar to you. You really don't know what they're saying or understand the words they're speaking, but if you watch it carefully enough, you can see it play out as a familiar scene, and you understand what's going on just from from your experience together with what you're listening to in the commentary. And eventually you learn the language. And once you learn the language, then you're pretty much in a good place to succeed. And that was the case at Discover. They translated for me pretty well, and they had great people there. So I really enjoyed my time at Discover, and I learned a great deal about business. And I also learned from my intelligence experience and transforming the FBI from straight line investigative function to one of intelligence led activity. I was able to transform the way we did private security from the way it's always been done, sort of the common, this is how we all do it dogma that we all face in private security, to one that blended in those experiences that I got from the FBI of changing how we did business. And when I was able to make that transition, I was able to create both at the Discover as well as at the Cubs a sort of a new way of approaching security that blended the best of the old world with the best of the new world into what I think is a fairly effective model.
That's great. And with that too, kind of that transition from FBI to private security, I know you hit on some of them. What were maybe some of the biggest similarities that you're like, hey, that's word for word very similar, but also biggest differences too between that FBI to private security space? Well,
some of the similarities were that people will tell you that a business isn't a bureaucracy, but it is. There are still steps you have to take, and you have to go through certain doors and thresholds in order to get your business proposal to a place where that could be staffed, funded, and executed. So that is very similar to the government sector. The government sector, as you can imagine, has its share of red tape and its share of sort of organizational requirements that have to be met before you get an approval for things. So in that way, they were very, very similar. They were different, but they were very similar. So I didn't have to, it wasn't like I had to learn an entirely new trick. I just had to learn a different way of doing the trick in order to get the job done. I think that the business versus my role at the FBI, the most significant difference, I think, was that at the FBI we were consumed with the threat, and we were consumed with like making sure that what we were doing was not only effective but also very timely, and we didn't have a whole lot of time to sort of sit around and mull things over before we took action. I think in the business environment, it's more mulling things over and making sure that you're doing things more efficiently than necessarily effective, because effective and efficient they're used commonly in the same sentence, but they mean very different things. So if you're being efficient, that means that you're sort of making sure that you're giving the company the greatest value for its money. and because of that, that slows you down. So that's sort of another way of slowing down an already slow bureaucracy. So for me, it was a very slow process, but once I learned how to maneuver it, we were able to get things done. And I think lastly, and probably the most significant point is that I think most private security, they have a job to do, and I think within most companies, security is something that they feel obligated to do. It's because it's not part of their primary business. It's not the way that they bring in revenue, and it's not the way that they pay salaries and keep their customers happy. They don't look at it as a infrastructure pillar. They think of it as something sometimes that just has to be done. And when you approach it like that, you don't get the significance of why security and safety are so important to your overall ability to carry out the business. Because if you forget those things, then you end up in a crisis mode that you're reacting to and recovering from. And so good security and good safety is preventative. It's also intelligence led, and it's also puts you in a position where you set yourself up for a win every single day, so you're not surprised by the crisis. The crisis should be eliminated as a risk category because you're so well prepared for it. And I think that's the primary difference.
Absolutely. And I guess one other question on top of that, for other people that I know, a lot of security directors I'm talking to are in a similar boat where they went from the police office or FBI to the private security space, kind of handling that bureaucracy. And like you said, it's kind of that, hey, we need to have it, but it's still it's at one piece of our whole business. So it's hard to get to it as much. What advice would you have for security directors either starting out or maybe just struggling this week or this month with getting some of their initiatives out to the table? Or how did you manage it with your organizations?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of reaching for perspective, right? You have to understand your business lines well enough to understand what's important to them. And then you have to figure out what your talking points should read that actually reflect more on their business line needs and goals than your own. But to look, instead of sort of the office of no, you should be the office of facilitate. And your facilitation and your sales pitches should be, this is how I can involve myself by you buying into my security plan and buying into my security processes. I am able to facilitate your business in the following way. So it's more of how you adapt what you're saying to how they think. And part of that is understanding what they think. So you need to take the time, shut your mouth and open your ears and listen to what they're saying to you so that you can actually, form the next sentence appropriately.
No, that's great. And so kind of moving to also the Chicago Cubs, I know that's where we got introduced to you for that. Would love to learn about just your experience and your time there, and maybe what challenges you faced and you see in sports organizations and sports teams that they face from a security perspective that's maybe unique to them.
Yeah, I think using the Chicago Cubs, another fabulous organization. Loved it there and loved all the people there as well. Still have a very close relationship with most everybody that I worked with there. So they have, unfortunately, they're out of the playoffs right now, but that's a blip on the radar. They'll be back next year. But I think that, in the sports environment, whether it be, National Football League or college football, or whether it's Major League Baseball or NBA or NASCAR, you have your security function has to be, if you do it right, it's almost invisible. So because you have customers and your customers come in the form of fans, most of these businesses have a very, very strong customer first ethic. And their approach is that, that you're paying a lot of money to sit in that seat and watch that ball game. So everything that has to do with the sports team and everything from security to customer service to the comfort of the seats to whether they can see the field, how loud the scoreboard is, and all of that is designed to make the customer be the most comfortable that they possibly can be. Now you mix with that sort of overall approach the fact that not all these fans are that well behaved. Some of these fans are pretty ill behaved, and so what you have to do is you have to figure out a way to, it's just like a simple risk approach. It's how do you identify the risk and then mitigate it the most effectively as you possibly can, keeping your corporate goals in mind. So if you have a difficult fan, you have to figure out how to identify that fan quickly, how to mitigate the situation around them the most effective way that you possibly can without disrupting the other fans who are there also paying to sit in the seat. So there's a balance between the fan who's misbehaving and when is misbehaving enough to remove them from the facility, because at that point they're crossing a line into disturbing other fans around them. So it's a balance. So an effective design within that requires a strategic approach, and you have to use, obviously you have to have really good humans. So at the Chicago Cubs, I was lucky. I had the best humans in the world there. The folks that were uniformed security folks, my managers, all of the customer service people, they were all really well equipped to be that effective fan-facing kind of face that we needed, and they really worked hard to do that. That was one of the qualities of the Cubs that I really take away, was how devoted they were to making sure that every fan had a good time while they were there, and that we weren't in their way, right? We weren't causing problems from them. So with that, you know, what you have to do is you have to understand the strengths of your team from a human perspective, and then give them the tools they need to be the most effective, and allow them to be as invisible as they possibly can be while they're doing their job effectively. And so it's a delicate balance. It's not something that's taken for granted or should be considered an easy task. But that's where we get to, you know, the interplay between skills, the way you approach the security construct and how you actually design your program, and then where do you find the correct technologies that maximize the effectiveness of that strategy.
No, that's great. And I know too, just our relationship starting with you guys too, would love to learn more about what kind of brought Skyla to the table on your mind, and what maybe some of the initiatives were to kind of help create more of that environment, and how maybe we assisted, and where it's a fit to even mesh with your other technologies too that were there and are.
Yeah, we were actually, and we had a fairly short set of practical issues that we had to solve for. So like we had this thing where, you know, people would find their way into the stadium in the middle of the night when there was no event going on. And so when you have, you know, a fixed number of security personnel that are responsible for, you know, operation of the Joint Operations Command, and they've got all the things that are going on inside of that stadium that they're watching, as well as Sloan Park, which is our campus in Arizona where we do spring training. So all of those security functions are merged and are interconnected. And so when you're looking at particularly CCTV cameras that might number 11, 1,200, or maybe in the thousands, it's impossible for you to follow and accurately collect information from every one of those cameras simultaneously, because they're not built that way. They're built to identify or to record activity that is within the aperture of that camera, and they're not smart enough to tell the operator and the jock when there's something happening in their camera view. So the disconnect is that if you don't have the right camera view on the screen at the time that something happens in front of the camera, you can't be proactive to that. You're basically forcing your CCTV camera system to become an historical record keeping mechanism, where if you have an incident, you can go back to the cameras and find out whether or not it recorded any of it, so that you can provide that to police, or you can use it in your own risk strategy planning, or wherever you're going to do with it. But it's sort of very limited in what you can do with a typical CCTV camera system. So because we had those practical problems of people that would climb the exterior of the stadium onto the second level, which, you know, creates all sorts of problems for the company as well from a liability perspective. So if somebody fell off of one of those girders, you know, 25 feet in the air and smashed themselves onto the sidewalk, it wouldn't be the Cubs' fault, or would it? Right? So you never know how a lawsuit will play out, and where you know, liability is where the lines of liability are drawn. So rather than worry about it on the litigation side of it, we tried to do everything we could to smartly prevent it. So we searched for a system that would allow us to maximize our ability to mitigate some of these problems that we weren't creating, but we had to mitigate quickly and effectively. And because you had so many cameras, as we went through the process of searching for the right tool, we landed on Skyla for a number of reasons. There were a number of very clear advantages they had over the competition, and one of them was price. The cost of the system is amazingly low. When you think of them, if you can maximize the use of the system, the gain that you get, the return on investment that you get is almost unmatched from what I could find in the competitive environment. Also, Skyla brought, I thought, a great team. Their technical team and their direct client relationships were among the strongest I've ever seen. In fact, they sent the team down, and we're actually sitting in our joint operations center for a week during the opening week of the home games in Chicago with the Cubs last year, or this season, and they were taking notes about everything we were doing, all the incidents that we were responding to, how we responded to them, and then they were able to sort of help us design and customize Skyla to help maximize our ability to respond to those situations and incidents in a more effective manner. So they helped us teach the system, and since it's AI driven, you can teach the system as you go. But I joke, it's like having a new puppy. If you don't want it to do 1 and 2 on your floor, you have to teach it to tell you when it needs to go out so that it can go. You can let it out or go take it for a walk so that it can relieve itself. And if you don't teach it that, you're going to have a constant mess in your house. Well, that's kind of like an AI process. If you don't teach it what you want it to know or teach it how you want it to respond, it's just not going to be that effective. So it's a relationship, and the staff that Skyla brought to us allowed us to really cross that threshold effectively. And so those are a couple of the main reasons why I thought Skyla was an awesome product.
That's great. And now we have the joy of having you on our board too. What kind of made you jump there? I know you left the Cubs and joined GSIS, and then we had the pleasure of you joining our board as well. What kind of made you transition, and what made you join the team too?
Well, I mean, I think that I was flattered by the invitation, right? So, and I was so impressed with Skyla as a product. I got to know the CEO and consider him just an absolute wonderful person. Their business ethics that they apply to this product, they're not reckless. They're very, very concerned about how the product would be used, and they're very aware of how either it could be used in a way that I think is perfectly legitimate, but could be spun in a different way. So I think they're very conscious about the product's use and what that means to the company. So I think that's to provide sort of a level of responsibility that I don't see very often in corporate America. They're pushing that product, and they're not really worried about the possible negative connotations that come from that. So that was part of it. And I was so impressed with the product. The product itself works really, really well. Again, it's something that you have to work with day over day, week over week, and you have to have a strategy to develop it. But once you get to a point where it is actually well defined and matured within your organization, it's not something you're going to take out of the box and it's going to do something for you. You've got to fit it into a strategy of how your personnel are deployed, what they're learning and what they're interested in, what you do with the information when you receive it, and making sure that you create a 360-degree circle so that you are fully learning from every opportunity you have to learn, so that you can be better at security, better at safety, and that customer has the absolute best possible experience that they can while they're on your campus. And that includes employees as well, not just and there's so many other ways that Skyla, that the product can be developed from an insider threat perspective that most people don't consider. Most people consider the threat being external to the doors of the stadium, but there's actually sometimes insider threat that is either intentional or non-intentional. But being able to sort of design your system to catch that type of activity is another way why this system is so affordable.
No, that's great, and that's where we look at it too. I'm talking with all of our business development managers of, okay, it's great that we check an intruder or a gun or whatever we're looking for, but what do you do with it? And I think you guys at the Cubs have fit that really well, and then also too now with the board and your wisdom too with the other areas we're going into is super helpful. And kind of on that note too, now being on the board and kind of taking a bigger, wider look with Skyla too, what other verticals, even outside of sports facilities and sports organizations, have you seen really Skyla being a good fit in, from conversations you've had and just conversations you're looking forward to?
Well, any security director or lead that has a strategic, methodology of and how they're approaching the job, and they're training their individual employees to understand their role in that overall strategy, which is something that I think is missing in private sector. You hire people to stand a post and they stand the post, and that's sort of the old way of doing business. But if you elevate the understanding of that person that's standing that post as to what that post really means in the overall security stratus and apparatus, and the strategy and apparatus, you end up with an employee that actually starts to think about what they're doing and what they're seeing, and their observations can actually lead you to the mitigation of risk faster than technology can. But giving them technological tools that allow them to maximize their capabilities is sort of the cherry on top. So what I would say to any of these directors is to have a clear strategy, make sure that they're training their people to do their portion of it, and understanding why they fit into the larger strategy and why they matter to the strategy. And then being able to create a second level of review that says, okay, here are the things that were spotted and assessed by the personnel on the ground, whether it's using Skyla, whether it's a patrol activity, whether it's just something they noticed when an employee went through a metal detector on their way into the office. These are all clues that allow you to sort of unravel and mitigate a bigger event, as long as you're keen to understanding them, and then you take some time to evaluate them on the backside. So the security apparatus has to be 360 degrees. That's what we do at GSIS. We help companies build that apparatus. But industries that would actually benefit from Skyla is basically anyone that has a CCTV camera system, and that includes corrections, law enforcement, Customs and Border Patrol, any kind of industrial complex, warehousing, any kind of hospital or school. All of these organizations, colleges and universities. I mean, that's a huge one. Any of these industries that utilize CCTV within their infrastructure of security need to take a hard look at Skyla, because Skyla, for a very affordable price, will absolutely maximize in ways you can never imagine. And if you have an intelligence-led security apparatus, you'll learn more from the integration of this technology into your normal day-to-day than you'll ever learn from and if you're waiting for something to happen and your plan is to react to it, you've already lost the game, and your company needs to look for somebody that thinks more strategically than that. Sorry.
No, that's great. No, that's great. And with that too, I know you kind of alluded to some of the other things, whether it's Skyla, whether it's metal detectors. What do you see as kind of some of the other future things that people should be looking at, and maybe even things that should be happening today, but it's kind of the today and the future of physical security and physical security technology?
I mean, we've already probably touched heavily on the overall sort of strategy, the 360-degree wheel that you have to look for, and that everything that happens you have to learn from, and then make connections with other things that have happened, and try to look for connectivity between them, because that's when you're going to find pre-operational surveillance, or you're going to find some link to or clue that the local police or the FBI want to know about. So that is something that you really need to continue to build into your project planning, and make sure that your company understands the value of that, because you're really, at the end of the day, mitigating risk. You have to understand clearly what your risks are. You understand what your tool sets are that allow you to mitigate that risk, and then that should then translate into return on investment, and how your security apparatus is actually saving the company money day over day, which is real dollars, and then also preventively. So you can talk about that. And I'll give you an example. We have one of the main threats to an open environment like a concert or a sporting event is high angle shooting threat. So we saw it in Las Vegas, Nevada, tragically play out a couple of years ago. But since then, MLB, for instance, as an example, has put a really high emphasis on sports teams and the security apparatus within those sports teams being able to understand and mitigate the risk that comes from a high-angle shooter. So what we were able to do is, because we were able to identify that all of our high-angle threats came from buildings that were in the horizon around Wrigley Field, but obviously weren't our buildings and weren't within our control, and may have had a varying different level of security at each of those buildings. So what you expect at one building from a security perspective or stance may not be the same at the next building next to it, but they're both inside of that threat range for sniper attack, right, against a fan or an employee or whatever, ownership, management, that kind of thing. So what we were able to do is we combined some high perched cameras that were strategically placed that had 360-degree capability. And then by attaching Skyla to that and teaching it to conduct a baseline of what the activity is on those rooftops on a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week basis, we were able to establish a baseline. So the activity on the roof of all those buildings that are within the shooting range of Wrigley Field, especially during games, whether it's day games or night games, because they provide different challenges, whether it's a day game or a night game, because all the lights are on, at the stadium at night. So you can see in, but they can't see out. So it presents different challenges to the event depending on what day or night it is. But by using Skyla to establish what the baseline of activity is on that roof line, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, especially during events that occur during the day or the evening, that baseline allows us then to allow Skyla to tell us when we have an anomaly. So the anomaly is something that doesn't look like the baseline activity, and could be when that anomaly, whatever it is then identified by the software and directly sent down to the Joint Operation Command Center of the Cubs. They can see on the camera what the anomaly is, and they can assess with their own brain as to whether or not that's a shooter threat, or whether it's just somebody up there swimming in January, right? Whatever, on the rooftop pool. So our ability to sort of mitigate the high angle shooting with the combination of standardized camera, technology with Skyla and the AI-based behavioral assessment that comes with, allows us to, I think, very effectively mitigate the high angle shooting threat. And I think it's a model for any other stadium or concert venue in the United States. So I would say if you've got that kind of a problem, you've got a high angle issue, you need to get down to the Chicago Cubs and find David and find Mario and have them explain to you how they fix that, because I think it's an ingenious way of combining existing technologies with manpower to solve a very difficult problem.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. Well, awesome. No, I really appreciate you, Jim, taking the time to chat with us. Before we go, one kind of fun question I know I'd asked before to kind of prep you on beforehand was, being in the FBI, I know there's a ton of FBI and action movies out there. Is there one or two movies that accurately resemble your experience in the FBI, or are they just totally all far-fetched, or maybe all of them are at least a little far-fetched, but which ones maybe accurately resemble your time?
Well, I laugh, I chuckle about that, because I very rarely ever watch anything in movies or television that have to do with my profession, because they are so far-fetched, and that's just for the entertainment value, right? So, but I would say that if I was to think about sort of a fun movie that I thought that I sort of envisioned myself as, it was Jamie Foxx in his role in the movie The Kingdom, which is a team that went, an evidence response team that went to Saudi Arabia to investigate a bombing over there. I actually led a team like that to Pakistan and had a very similar situation, absent the kidnappings and the attempted beheadings that come in that movie, which is where I see myself. That's how I see what I did when I went to Pakistan. It was actually not that fancy or prolific. But and in another movie, which so The Kingdom is kind of a fun movie to watch that I liked. And then the other one was like a movie that was made several years ago with Don Cheadle called The Traitor, which is more of how a government informant was used to infiltrate a terrorist organization and how that all turns out. And although, many of the things that happen in the movie aren't necessarily accurate because of the way things actually play out bureaucratically in the United States regarding who's got what and whose responsibilities fall where, It was a very interesting movie, and I thought John Cheadle did a great job in that movie. He's I'm a big fan of his as a result. And anything Denzel Washington did. I don't know if he was ever in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all three powerhouses right there.
Right.
Really, you can't go wrong. And to be, yeah, I'm not. There's no sales movie yet that I guess Don Cheadle did have a sales show, but other than that, that's about it. So that's awesome. Well, Jim, I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me, and yeah, thank you so much for what you're doing for security directors everywhere and partnering with Skyla too. We really appreciate your relationship with us, being on our board, and just all the wisdom you've brought to both the Chicago Cubs for that specific individual instance, but then also to all of our other customers and having you as a resource. So we thank you.
Thank you, Brennan. Appreciate it. Had fun.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.